Welcome to Rambam In-Depth. Today we're going to be discussing the Rambam Perek Yutes Behilchas Tumeis Meis Halacha Vav. In the middle of this halacha, the Rambam makes the following summation. Kvar beyarnu b'nazirus. We already explained in the laws of a Nazir. A Nazir is a person who makes a vow to be a Nazir, which precludes drinking wine, coming in contact with the dead, and not cutting the hair. So there, the Rambam explained. Now, what happens if a Nazir becomes Tameh? Let's say a Nazir has a 30-day period when he has to keep the laws of Nazirus, but if he becomes Tameh, that nullifies those 30 days, and he has to start all over again. He has to bring special sacrifices. So he explained there, Shim haya ha-Nazir, ukazayis menames tachas ha-gamol, or tachas ha-mita, ukiyotze v'mishar ha-kelim. Let's say the Nazir had a size of a kazayas, of an olive, of a dead body, underneath the camel, or underneath the bed, or any other kalim, any other vessels. And the law is that if there's no space between the camel and the vessels, that the impurity just pierces through and makes the vessels tameh. So even though, even though the vessels become tameh, and it's a 7-day period of impurity, the Nazir would not have to cut his hair off and bring the sacrifices that are associated with a Nazir who becomes Tameh. In other words, the Rambam divides the laws pertaining to a Nazir into two categories. There is a category of certain types of impurity in which the Nazir has to redo the whole thing and he has to bring special sacrifices. And there are those cases where the Nazir is Tameh, but he doesn't have to undo what he had accomplished before. It doesn't nullify the days of Nazirus, and he doesn't have to bring the sacrifices. And then he draws a parallel, a Misham Atalamed, and from this we could learn Shekol Elu ha'alaches ha'amuris b'tumas ayolim hanasim min ha'adam and min ha'behema and min ha'kelim, that all the laws concerning the impurity that relates to an ohel, to the tent that's created by virtue of a person or an animal or vessels, and there is a contraction of tumah, hakol medivrei seifrim. These are all medivrei seifrim. Literally, divrei seifrim means words of the scribes. Now, it sounds like he's saying that they are all based on rabbinical law, not biblical law. But then he qualifies that. Mehen divrei Kabbalah, of these that are called divrei seifrim, are words of Kabbalah. Kabbalah means received tradition, passed down from generation to generation, starting off with Moses on Mount Sinai. So they're not mentioned in the Torah, but they were passed down by God to Moses and then to subsequent generations. Umihen gzeiros v'hachakes. And some of these laws are rabbinical decrees to distance ourselves from possible violation of other laws. And because they're only divrei seifrim, they're based on tradition, whether they're tradition going back to Sinai or tradition based on the rabbis. Ein hanazir megaleach aleihen. The Nazir does not have to shave his hair and start the whole process over again. Ve'ein chayavim aleim kares al beis migdash. And likewise, if a person in this state of impurity walks into the Beis HaMikdash while it's forbidden, he doesn't incur the penalty of kares, of premature death, or achilas kedashov, or he's not going to get the penalty for eating something that's holy, a sacrifice that's holy. So then in what respect are these things tameh? If the person is tameh based on the tradition, what is the implication of that? Ve'ein hadvarim kulon amurim ela le'inyan tumas truma v'kodshim b'lvad. This is only with respect to truma, the tithes that you give to the kohen, and sacrifices, exclusively. In other words, they will become tameh, and you can't eat the truma. A kohen can only eat truma that's tahar, and likewise the sacrifices cannot be consumed. Kamesha biyarna, as we explained elsewhere in a earlier chapter, that they become tameh, you can't eat them, or if anyone who ate these things, they cannot enter the Beis HaMikdash, but there's no kares for that. So in other words, the Rambam seems to divide the laws of impurity into biblical and rabbinical. The truth is that that's not necessarily the conclusion over here. There's a Rambam in his introduction to the Book of Commandments, Sefer HaMitzvahs, where he gives 14 ground rules. What is counted as one of the 613 commandments? and what is not counted. In the second ground rule, he speaks about how things that are derived from rules of interpretation, the 13 methods of interpretation, are not counted in the 613 commandments. The Ramban, Nachmanides, and others take strong issue with the Rambam, and they understand that the Rambam was saying that if it's not stated explicitly in the Torah, it's not considered to be biblical. And they refute that argument and that premise. And they also refer to the fact that the Rambam seems to be consistent with that. And the Rambam in Hilchas Ishus, the laws of marriage, we know that the Mishnah says there are 3 ways in which a marriage can take effect, either with kesef, by giving an article of value, money, an article of value, shtar, a contract, or bia, having relations. Those are the 3 methods through which a marriage takes effect. However, the Rambam says, the giving of a ring, he doesn't use a ring, but kesef, something article of value, is only medivrei seifrim, from the words of the scribes, implying that it's only rabbinical. Why? Because it's based on a method of interpretation, a gzera shava. In one place it uses the term kicha, taking, and it refers to kesef, to money. And therefore, when it talks about kicha in the context of kedushin, ki yikach ish isha, it refers to money. Since it's not explicitly in the Torah, it's based on a method of interpretation. It's only medivrei seifrim, which is understood by the Ramban and others who criticize the Rambam, that the Rambam is saying that these are not biblical. And they take issue with that. The truth is, as many other commentators say, that that's not what the Rambam is talking about. And some of the answers that they give to the Rambam's opinion is based on this Rambam over here. The Rambam is not saying that because it's not explicitly in the Torah, it's not considered a full-fledged biblical form of impurity. He's saying is that sometimes the basis of the impurity is not written in the Torah, but it was passed down from Moses. That's considered to be equal to anything written in the Torah. It also has the status of something biblical. You can't call it biblical, min ha-Torah, because it's not written in the Torah explicitly, but it was passed down. And likewise, methods of interpretation, even though they're valid and they're just as strong as biblical, they are not explicitly mentioned in the Torah, so they're in a separate category, and we label them divrei seifrim. However, they are still considered to be as valid as biblical. And in fact, the Rambam would definitely agree if someone married a woman by giving her a ring, an article of value, and then she commits adultery, that would be punishable by the penalties ascribed to adultery, which is a capital crime, and if there's witnesses and there's a warning and so on. But if the marriage was only a rabbinical marriage, it only took effect rabbinically, why would there be a case of karas, of misa, actually a death at the hands of the courts? And if there was no witnesses and no warning, there would be a penalty by the hands of Hashem. Another example would be if a Kohen marries a non-Bas Kohen, an Israelite woman, she's entitled to eat truma, even if he only gave her kesef, and there was nothing else to make that marriage take effect. If the marriage is only rabbinical, how could she eat truma? A woman who's not a Bas Kohen cannot eat truma unless she's married to a Kohen. So we see from this that the Rambam would have to agree that it has biblical effect or comparable to a biblical effect. It's just not in the same category and therefore should not be classified as one of the 613 commandments. And the same thing over here, a Nazir would not go through the whole procedure because this is not the most explicit form of impurity. It has it's a different category, but it doesn't make it less than biblical.